Hi, I'm Veronica and I love to knit. And one of the things I help do for Miss Babs is to knit some of the sample garments you see in our booth at shows. One of the things I do to help make those garments look their best is to alternate skeins of yarn while I knit. Like in this sample here, where I've got a skein of green and blue yarn to knit 2 skeins at the same time. This is just to demonstrate. We're going to come back to that later. But no, you don't have to cut the yarn. In this tip, we're going to talk about why you should consider alternating skeins in your projects, and I'm going to give you some tips depending on what kind of project you're going to make. So a little overview. Hand-dyed yarns, even if they're from the same dye lot, have natural differences between them, and this is just a feature of how hand-dyed yarn works. One skein may be a little darker or a little lighter. Just gives you a little more artistic look to your project. So alternating skeins does add a little bit of work, but it's a much more polished piece when you're finished. I'd like to show you a couple of reasons why you want to alternate. So we're going to look at some samples that weren't alternated and how I think they don't look so great. In this sweater, you can see that it has some lighter areas and some darker areas, leading to a color blocked effect when the garment is worn. This sweater has a similar issue in which you see some darker areas, darker places in the yarn, and lighter places up here. You can it's a little more obvious if we show you the seam on the sweater where there's a darker side and a lighter side. And so alternating skeins can help you avoid this color blocked look. However, if you have some smaller projects like these shawlettes or cowls or socks, you can get a different effect with variegated yarns, and that's totally okay. So if you want to use a variegated crazy yarn like this, you may see places in your knitting where the color stacks up, and we call this pooling. Some people like this, some people don't care, and it's okay. So this is just letting the yarn do the work for you. In this yarn and these socks, you might be able to see that the center of this yarn is a little bit lighter, and the outside of the yarn is a little bit darker. It has a little more color on it. This is something that just happens with hand-dyed yarn, and it's okay, but it can lead to slight differences in your work. So these socks were knit from one ball of yarn, but this one has a little less pink, this one has a little more pink. It's a little subtle. It may or may not bother you, so it's just kind of a choice you make. Next, I want to look at what it looks like when you do have alternated skeins. So this is a sweater I knit, and as you can see, there's no unintended stripes or color blocks, and the whole garment looks pretty well planned. If I'm to turn the sweater inside out, you can see where I've carried the yarn up the inside of the sweater. It makes a nice little line. I didn't have to cut my yarn at all. I just knit with 2 skeins, 1 row from each skein. So now I want to talk a little bit about how to alternate skeins for different kinds of projects. First, we would just want to figure out, are we knitting flat or are we knitting in the round? And in both cases, you're going to be knitting little stripes across your garment. If you're knitting in the round, you'll want to change your yarn every row or every round. If you're knitting flat, you'll be knitting 2 row stripes. You'll need to carry your yarn up the side of your knitting, not too loose and not too tight. So I'm going to show you how on a couple of swatches I have here. First, I'd like to start with some flat knitting. And as you can see, I've knit some skinny stripes in blue and green on this swatch, just to demonstrate how the different colors change. Again, you don't have to cut the yarn. So I've got blue right now on the needles, and I want to change to green. So I'm going to bring my green yarn up from underneath, hold my blue yarn to the back, and just gently bring it up the side and knit the first stitch. Again, not too loose, not too tight. And just continue knitting. So I've knit a row, and now I'm at the end of purling a row with my green yarn. Just want to finish that up. And we're back to where we would use our blue yarn. So go ahead again, turn that over, hold the green yarn down, and bring the blue yarn up from underneath. And again, just gently, not too loose, not too tight, and we'll start knitting with that. This is great for a project that's knit flat where you have seams. If for some reason you have a project that the side edge is exposed, you're going to want to try to alternate a few stitches in from the edge of the fabric, and that works basically the same way. Another thing we can do is, while knitting in the round, I have a sock here with 2 balls of yarn attached, again just to demonstrate how that would look. And when we come to the beginning of the round, we have both yarns. I'm going to bring I ended the round with 1 yarn, and I'm going to bring the other yarn up from underneath it and start knitting the round with that new yarn. And by crossing them over, it avoids any gaps at the beginning of the round. So here we're coming to the end of the round. I'm going to knit to the end of the round with 1 ball of yarn. And bring my next yarn up from underneath. Sometimes when you have 2 balls of yarn, they can get a little tangled. You just want to keep an eye on those as you're knitting. As I change yarns, let's just take a quick look at the back of the knitting. And you can see here where the yarn is carrying up the inside. Not too loose, not too tight. So we'll go ahead and hold the old yarn out of the way and start again with our new yarn. That's all you do, it's just stripes. So I have a couple of examples of tension. So you do kind of want to pay a little bit of attention to how tight you're pulling those yarns at the edge. You don't want your edge to pucker, and you don't want any kind of loops hanging off the edge of your garment. So for our example that was knit flat, you can probably see here how this edge has drawn in, and it's very tight, and it puckers, and that was pulled too tightly. This edge in the middle is pretty good, springy, and then this edge up at the top is too loose. In this sample, which was knit in the round, you can see down here it was knit a little too tightly. It's kind of puckered in. In the center, we did a good job with the tension, and at the top it's too loose. You can kind of see through those stitches. Finally, if you have more than 2 skeins to use in your project, you're going to want to think ahead a little bit to make sure that you're including all of them in your sweater as you knit. I hope this tip lets you successfully alternate skeins in your next project. It takes a little more time, it takes a little getting used to, but I think once you have it down, it's not too difficult, and I think you'll be really glad you spent the time. It'll make your finished project look much more professional.